All right, we got some breaking news, folks. Out of college football, really, it's the weekly release of the latest AP Top 25. Got some movement in the top 10 with Oklahoma by virtue of its win over Texas. Moves up 7 spots to number 5. The Longhorns with the loss still stays in the top 10, but Steve Sarkisian's group does drop to 9. USC, by the way, for the 3rd straight week, gets a win, but drops down in the polls. It was a nail-biter, 3 overtime thriller for Caleb Williams and company to come away with a win. From 11 to 19, I should say there. Washington State falls there. Louisville is a big riser in the AP Top 25, 11 spots to 14. Great time to be a basketball school right now in the college football game. And then lastly, from 21 through 25, we do have Fresno State coming out of the rankings with their loss at Wyoming. Kansas, another basketball school, gets into the top 25. Kentucky with a loss to Georgia remains inside of that. And Miami drops 8 spots after the ending that had a lot left to be desired if you're a Canes supporter and fan. With that lead, 75 yards to go. Mario Cristobal and company losing at home to fall to 4-1. All right. Let's bring in Chip Patterson of the Cover 3 podcast to break it down. There's a lot of schools and themes to talk about. Let's first start with the Red River rivalry and the fallout from that game here. So OU moves into contention, not necessarily as it stands today, CFP contention, but what impressed you the most about the Sooners here? And big picture, what do you think about them?
I would say that in the game itself, the way that defensive line was really able to impose its will against the Texas offensive line. Yes, they took significant injury in that game, but it still is an offensive line that I respect as one of the best in the conference. And that is where Brent Venables has built, sort of from a big picture, the identity of this Oklahoma team. Because yes, Dillon Gabriel and that fast up-tempo veer and shoot offense is a big part of what the Sooners are going to do and a carryover from what our mind thinks about in terms of a college football playoff contender in Norman. But the reason why Oklahoma is now in the driver's seat in the Big 12 and controls its own destiny for the college football playoff is because Brent Venables, the former defensive coordinator, has fixed that defense. I thought it was a huge part of that win on Saturday.
What's your take on Texas and potentially these two teams can face off again with a chance to get to the college football playoff? Who knows their Chip, but how tough of a loss is this for Sark and company?
Really disappointing, and I think that it's more that this Texas team had felt after the Alabama win in Tuscaloosa that they were on some sort of track for destiny. We actually really hadn't had that Texas as a national championship contender conversation. And when that field goal went through, the go-ahead field goal, I think that a lot of Longhorns fans thought that they were there. And then to allow Oklahoma to get down into scoring position, to allow Dillon Gabriel to get that game-winning score, I think it's just absolutely crushing. Any Texas fan that had doubts about Steve Sarkisian and this Longhorns team, they are unfortunately inflamed. But here's the good news, because you mentioned rematch. Texas will be favored in every game coming down the stretch. It's going to be sitting there with the egg and the spoon trying to stay in the college football playoff conversation. But I do believe that they are of that caliber. And certainly they're still a top 10 team here in the AP Top 25 that they can set up a rematch against the Sooners with a spot in the CFP on the line.
Let's get to another ranked game in terms of fallout from over the weekend. It's going to be Notre Dame and Louisville. Let's first start with Notre Dame, just because they were on the road. The record against ACC opponents was stellar. They covered against Duke at the end. They were favored this time against Louisville and weren't able to get it done. What stood out to you about the Fighting Irish and Sam Hartman unable to perform as expected?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because we had discussed on the Cover 3 podcast that it didn't necessarily need to be a physical fatigue. It might be a mental fatigue, emotional fatigue of playing back-to-back-to-back prime-time games, these huge pressure-filled moments when, as a player, you're just sitting on your hands all day, antsy, ready to go. I have to imagine that started to eat up at them a little bit, especially going up against a Louisville team that was just well-coached, primed in that electric atmosphere in Cardinal Stadium. So I I'm surprised that the AP voters dropped Notre Dame, interestingly enough, even behind a Duke team that it had just defeated a little bit earlier. But we know that at this point in the season, if you are a 2-loss team, it's going to be very difficult for you to split ties in the eyes of voters against 1-loss teams. So Notre Dame hanging on in the AP top 25. I kind of think this was a dramatic overreaction, but you lose by double digits when you're a favorite of nearly a touchdown. I think that a lot of people are maybe selling that Notre Dame stock, maybe a little too early. But of course, we've got that USC game to correct it all here in the coming week.
And we'll talk about the Trojans in just a second. But 11 spots down for Notre Dame, 11 spots up for the Cardinals of Louisville. Do you think that move is warranted? And what stands out to you about what they were able to get done on Saturday night?
Yeah, the move is warranted. I believe that while Louisville's not a perfect team right now, and I would not take Louisville over Florida State in the ACC, it just logged a phenomenal win against a quality team and really brought validation to an undefeated profile that wasn't getting a lot of respect because it lacked some of those higher end opponents. So when you have a 0 in the loss column and we are in the month of October, I've got no problem with you jumping on an elevator right to the top of the rankings. And that's exactly what Louisville did. They were sitting there on the edge of the top 25. Everyone respected that they were a power conference team with a couple power conference wins, but they needed to be able to go and get that ranked dub to be able to really start to, stand in there in that top 15 area. It's exactly what they did. So I think this is a fair movement up. They're landing there right there with North Carolina, Louisville, North Carolina, Florida State, all undefeated, and none of them play each other. We're in for chaos, Tommy, chaos.
Since you brought up North Carolina, actually, let's just quickly talk about the Tar Heels. Drake May just dropping points. Where are you at right now in terms of where they stand, and where do you have them pegged in the league order?
North Carolina might be good. I'm very wary of that. They were 4-0 for the first time since 1997. Now 5-0 for the first time since 1997. Historically, under Mac Brown, they've come out of that off week a little bit rusty, a little bit creaky. And like you mentioned, Drake May is really starting to level up. He didn't play great at the beginning of this season. Now he is showing the form that had him in that Heisman Trophy conversation in July, has him on those NFL draft boards. He is playing really, really well right now. And I think that what we are going to see is a really important stretch. North Carolina gets Miami at home. North Carolina gets Virginia at home. Then there's some colossal matchups later in the season. Clemson, NC State. So I think the Tar Heels might be good. But they are going to be judging themselves against their own history of falling a little bit short. But these are all winnable games coming up. So they could enter November with some real stakes.
All right, let's get to the Pac-12 conversation. I mentioned the Trojans continue to win, but they continue to drop. You're giving me the yuck. I mean, to have to eke it out against an Arizona team and have Caleb Williams bail them out there at the end. Where are you at with the Trojans, who seem to still be hanging on to sort of preseason lore?
Yeah, without Caleb Williams, this is a very average football team. And it speaks to how excellent Caleb Williams is, that they are so extraordinary and they continue to be worthy of being ranked highly. I am so disappointed that USC throughout an entire offseason talking about fixing the defense and going to the transfer portal, that this Trojans team just continues to fall a little bit short. I know Lincoln Riley says that, our defense saved that game on Saturday night, but I really think that we've got to go back and realize that USC is being held up by its quarterback. If they have an average replacement level Power 5 quarterback, this is a team that's probably destined for 7-5 or 8-4. Instead, because you have Caleb, now you are still talking about a team that could be in the college football playoff. The question is, do you trust USC to continue to play with fire and win these games all the way down the stretch? I'll point you to the Pac-12 title game and just one pulled hammy at the end of a run and how that changed the Trojans' postseason future. I think this is who they are. It kills my bedtime. It makes for some entertaining upset alerts. But other than that, USC really propped up by Caleb Williams right now.
And the teams that are ahead of them also in the rankings, when you talk about Washington and Oregon, may not have the best quarterback, but they have pretty good quarterbacks and maybe more complete teams than SC at the moment. And the Trojans, of course, dealing in a very loaded Pac-12 with the likes of Utah, which had a bye week. What's your big takeaway for Wazoo and UCLA, Chip?
Bad, disappointing loss for Washington State, but the big takeaway is UCLA's defense. Now, I had been looking at my numbers going into this week, and I was seeing that UCLA's defense, particularly up front, was really starting to look outstanding. And I was like, whoa, wow, because UCLA's defense was its weakness during a lot of that Dorian Thompson-Robinson era under Chip Kelly. And I was really curious to see how that group would handle an explosive quarterback like Cam Ward and a Cougars offense that had been ripping everybody up. I think Dante Moore still has some growing to do. I think this UCLA offense still has some growing to do. But it is a big takeaway to look at UCLA and look at a talented quarterback like Dante Moore, who has not quite arrived, and understand that's where the improvement can be. That UCLA's defense, which was a weakness in years prior, I think had a big validation moment against Washington State. UCLA is a pretty good football team. They just need to get a little better on offense. And I did not think we'd say that about Chip Kelly's squad.
Chip, we got to talk about Mario Cristobal. What happened to the Canes, and should they have dropped out of the top 25?
I would have dropped them out of the top 25, and they've got that win against Texas A&M. But outside of the win against Texas A&M, there's not a lot on that profile that's going to encourage you to say they are one of the 25 best teams in the country. And then Texas A&M gets a hit as they pick up another defeat to Alabama at home. The profile is not very strong, and then I think that you do have to overreact a little bit, even if just for 1 week, to what was just stunning decision making from the sideline, poor execution on the field on defense. Just not a lot was crisp or elite coming out of an off week. That is the most disappointing thing, I think, for Miami fans, is that you're looking at this team that had a whole week off to try and settle in after a 4-0 start and really get focused on making a run at the ACC championship and contending with Florida State. And to see a game, not just, it should never have been that close. The mistakes were all throughout the game, but certainly not kneeling when it would have iced the game is the one that stings the most.
If Miami would have been able to pull it out, we were now projecting ahead before I let you go. Obviously I get you, Oregon-Washington would be a great game. UNC-Miami on paper was supposed to be a great game, which is lessened a little bit with what the Canes are doing. But what are you looking out for this week in college football as it pertains to the top 25?
Well, the Oregon-Washington game is absolutely massive. I'm glad that you mentioned that North Carolina-Miami game, because I still think that our point spread of that is going to indicate that this is a coin flip game. And it is going to be the great challenge of Mario Cristobal's young tenure as Miami's head coach, and whether he is going to be able to get this team mentally ready to go on the road and take on Drake May and a talented North Carolina team playing with a lot of momentum and a lot of confidence. All eyes and a very, very close microscope are going to be on the Canes all throughout the week. And so, yeah, Oregon-Washington, that's the one that matters for the Pac-12 and the playoff. But if you just want to talk about intrigue in terms of high-profile programs and coaches, how does Miami get back up off the mat after that embarrassment? Point spread says it's going to be a close game and won at the margins, and they need to get better at winning at the margins.
Man, that would have been a great hat-trick tier of games. You had SC and Notre Dame, you had Miami and UNC, and of course we talked about that showdown in the Pacific Northwest. Chip Patterson breaking it down here of the Cover 3 podcast. Chip, certainly appreciate it. Again, taking a look at the notable top 25 movement. Miami still hanging around. Double-digit moves from the fallout game between Notre Dame and Louisville. And what we're not showing here, too, of course, is the #1 team in the country, Georgia, which took care of Kentucky, laying 14.5. They're on the road in Nashville to take on Vanderbilt, and they will be north of 30-point favorites in a game you can watch Saturday on CBS.